Hello, my name is Margaret Medora, and I'm a social worker here at Children's Center Thunder Bay, working for the Preschool Assessment and Consultation Program. We have three main roles here at the Preschool Assessment and Consultation Program. The first of which is to go into programs and support children who are having a hard time in that setting, so usually a specific referral for a particular child. Secondly, we sometimes go into programs and do a little bit more of a broad program consultation if a center is looking for maybe some overall general changes that can be made to better support the children in that environment. And then we also offer professional development opportunities, such as this presentation today focused on temperament. We've been trying to pre-record a variety of topics of interest to educators in hopes that people find that they have a little bit more flexibility in terms of when they watch the content and sort of at their own pace are able to go back and rewind, re-listen to things. Also knowing that you can reach out. I put my email here, Margaret Medora, mmedora@childrencenter.ca. So feel free if you have any follow-up questions or anything like that to contact me. Also know that you can contact your RC that works for your program because we work very closely with the SNRP team, and they might have a lot of ideas and strategies to enhance this presentation and make it more relevant to your center. And also know that we are available for sort of referrals to talk specifically about some of our presentation topics and make it more relevant to your center. So after watching this, there is a discussion question guide that you can use and see if you are wanting to book myself or my coworker to come in and almost do sort of like a follow-up workshop related to the topic of the presentation you're watching. So after watching this temperament presentation, consider that if you have a need. I'll get started on the presentation now. Just know that I will be turning off the video just so that I don't have the distraction of seeing my face, and that's so that my face isn't blocking any of the slide content for you. So here we go. Before beginning the presentation, I just want to be in keeping with our following the recommendations from the Truth and Reconciliation Act. We do our best to follow as many of them as we possibly can. And it's important to acknowledge that we are actually in the Robinson Superior Treaty Territory of 1850, and the land on which we are working, living, and serving our children, youth, and families is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabeg. We want to recognize and honor the contributions made to our community by the Métis people and the enduring presence of all Indigenous peoples on this land. Our agenda for today around child temperament will be looking at what specifically is temperament and why is it important in the childcare setting. We'll look at three main types of temperament, and then we'll break it down further into 9 specific traits, and that will be a really good area of insight. We have some little table graphs just to kind of show the high and low end of each of these traits. And we'll sort of think about why that can be difficult for the children in our centers and us in terms of how those match up. And then we'll sort of talk a little bit about some ideas and strategies for the classroom. But again, this might be a little bit more of a food for thought kind of element at the end of the presentation that might benefit from consultation with an RC or with PACP to make it a little bit more specifically relevant. So when we're talking about temperament, it's important first to kind of think about how we as humans like to categorize things and understand things better. So when you think about adults, we sort of go to talking about temperaments, personality, all those kinds of things. And there's so many different theories and tests that you can do on the internet to kind of give some insight and try to help people understand, why do I respond this way? Why do I feel this way? And just sort of how it impacts interactions with others and all those kinds of things. So there's quite a few. I'm not going to go over all of them, but you may have heard of the 4 different temperaments. A lot of people are doing the Myers-Briggs personality types surveys on the internet and sort of trying to figure out where they lie, the colors, blue, green, orange, gold, and also knowing that there's sort of a personality test that looks at 5 main areas, including openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And I think very popular in the childcare setting is the tribes. So you're probably all familiar with a little bit of each of these things. But the important thing to know when we're looking at children is that most of these aren't very scientifically proven, and a lot of them are more just for our own personal interest. And again, as humans, trying to categorize and better understand things, but they don't usually seem to apply to children. So when we're talking about children, we're going to look specifically at temperament. And this word refers to personality traits that determine how someone reacts to the world. If you think back to some of the newborns that you know, you've probably noticed that, wow, they really came out a certain way. As soon as they were in the world, they were reacting maybe with high intensity, lots of loud crying, or maybe they were actually low intensity and they were pretty chill and they didn't really notify you about something being wrong, like hungry or tired or uncomfortable. They just sort of were quiet and not as responsive. Um, so, well, the traits of temperament are mostly innate, but it's important to remember that they can be influenced by family, culture, experiences, and that they can sort of be modulated by different environmental factors, parent response, all these different components of the environment over time. So you might even think about yourself and say, you know what, I used to be really kind of stuck in my ways and particular about things. And I've actually over time become a little bit more relaxed about things. So know that they're hard to change, I would say. They're sort of what we come into this world with, but they can be influenced and modulated a little bit over time. And what we can do as adults is sort of help the child with what they come with to be a little bit more adaptable and comfortable in the world by changing either our approach or certain things in the environment that might slowly help them with that trait over time. So, temperament matters because it's important to understand the children and what they sort of live with every day and the program. So this understanding that we grow to learn about them can change how we see their behavior and maybe adjust our expectations a little bit and not jump to conclusions about why they might be doing certain things or that they're being necessarily behavioral when really they might just be responding to their environment in the way that's according to their temperament traits. So it really gives us another level of understanding. So there are sort of 3 main simplified types of child temperament. And of course, you're not going to find a child always being in every situation, easy and flexible, I can do it, or always difficult and active, like, I'm not going to do that. I want to do what I want to do, or feeling a little bit more shy and slow to warm up and feeling like I can't do it. I'm a little bit intimidated. So just know their kids are going to be moving through these different overall temperaments, but you might find that some fit pretty well into a certain category most of the time. So about 40% of children are sort of considered to be easy, 10% are considered to be difficult, and about 15% are considered to be slow to warm up. That leaves another kind of 40% that don't fit into any one category and have a little bit more variability of all of these traits. So when we break it down a little bit more, when we look at an easy or flexible child, typically this child is a little bit more regular in terms of their rhythm. So their eating and sleeping patterns, those kinds of things. They're a little bit more adaptable, approachable, usually in more of a positive mood. Um, and they're usually a little bit easier for caregivers to respond to and deal with and get on the right track. often a little easier to toilet train, sleeping better, a little bit better feeding and napping. They're a little bit better in new situations and deal with people pleasantly. They can usually adapt to changes in their environment pretty well, often sort of cheerful, and they might express their distress or frustration, but mildly. Often they may show deep feelings with only one single tear rolling down their cheek. The difficult or feisty group is the opposite of this. They may be hard to get to sleep through the night. You might have trouble feeding them. Their nap schedule might be really difficult to get on a rhythm. And they are often a little bit more difficult to toilet train because of the irregularity in when they go to the bathroom. They also might be a little bit more resistant to doing something like that because it's new and different and maybe a little bit uncomfortable. They often fuss or cry more loudly at anything new and a little bit more slow to adapt. Usually, this type of child expresses an unpleasant or disagreeable mood. Often, if frustrated, they might have more temper tantrums. Um, in terms of the reaction, they might have a little bit more tendency to be a noisy, loud reaction. And it may not even signify like a bigger level of severity. It might just be that they react more strongly. Often the best way to handle these outbursts is just to kind of wait them out. Caregivers who don't always understand this type of temperament as normal is that they sometimes feel resentful for the child and really stressed out by the difficulty in managing the behavior that comes with their difficult temperament. So sometimes they may react in a way that's not helpful to the child, such as scolding or, just constantly giving in so that they appease the child and avoid tantrums, which really often reinforces some of that difficult behavior. Really, what they benefit from is that understanding, patience, consistency, and really learning about yourself so that you know how to respond, even if you don't have the best goodness of fit. But it will help them adjust to life's demands over time if you can have that kind of approach with them. So finally, the slow to warm up group is the children who are often sort of termed as shy. This child has a little bit of discomfort with new things and adapts slowly. But unlike the feisty or difficult child, the negative mood is often expressed slowly, and the child may not be as extreme in their reactions, and they might be a little bit less irregular. So they might be a little bit more similar to the easy temperament in terms of the regulation of their body functions. They usually are the child who sort of stands at the edge of the group and they're a little bit quiet around new people. They may be hesitant at birthday parties. They may not always want to go to group care or activities. Even if they do end up enjoying it, they have a hard time going and transitioning to these kinds of activities. If the child is pressured or pushed to join the group, it actually might make the shyness worse. It's really good to follow their pace and follow their lead and slowly encourage over time rather than force to jump in. If they're allowed to become accustomed to their new surroundings, they usually become active, happy member of the group. So just thinking about all these different main categories and how you may see this in the childcare setting and what it means to your sort of functioning as a group and how you're responding to each one. So we are going to further break down the temperament traits that we talked about quite a few of them in this little description of each main category, but know that there are 9 main temperament traits. And we'll go through all of these and specifically what they really refer to, and then looking at the sort of high version of this and then the low version, and know that there's definitely lots of kids who are going to be in between, but probably ones that stand out in your mind will be ones that are like either particularly high or low. As you can see, even just in this picture, it's pretty clear that these babies probably have very different temperaments. One is sort of looking over the edge of the couch, very much on the move. So they're probably a very high activity level and possibly distractive distractibility, sorry, level. And then you see this one sort of looking out very calm, patiently, maybe just waiting for the next instructions. Maybe it's actually one who is a little bit more of that slow to warm up, isn't too sure about this new environment, maybe not quite ready to engage yet, especially if you compare to our little guy on the right here, who looks as if they might be looking at something of interest, maybe a person, and actively engaging and sort of jumping right in. So it's kind of interesting when you look at babies from the get-go and just really notice, oh, wow, they came out with this. I have a little bit of a feisty, difficult temperament son who was pretty intense in his reactions. And I always laugh to myself because really, from day one, he was very impatient and very vocal in terms of letting me know what was going on and what was needed. So it's kind of neat and neat to see how that can sort of be modulated over time in terms of how I've been responding to him. So the first trait that we're going to talk about is activity level. So this is looking specifically at their motor activity, gross and fine. I think a lot of times we think about it as gross motor because a lot of active kids are constantly in motion, but it also really does mean looking at how they use their hands and even engage when they're really little in activities like puzzles or things that they want to put together or do. So, if we're looking at a really young baby around 2 months, you'll find that they're often moving in their sleep, wriggling during diaper changes, just constantly on the move. They've got their feet kicking, their hands moving a lot. Um, Whereas a low activity child would really be a little bit more at peace looking in their body. They might not move very often. You'll kind of look at them on the baby monitor and, oh, wow, they're still in the same position, sleeping like a log. They kind of quietly lie there and allow themselves to be diapered. Um, they might be more likely to be more snuggly and just sort of sitting in one place doing something rather than making those efforts to kind of move their bodies and kick and flail their arms and those kinds of things. Around 2 years old, you'll find these high activity children to be climbing, maybe getting into things, opening and closing cupboards out of all the time, maybe trying to crawl in and out of their crib or bed frequently, whereas a low activity child might be, accept that this is my space where I am, I'm going to stay put, less movement of their body, might enjoy some quiet play, doing things like puzzles, reading books, coloring, those types of things. Around 10 years old, you'd see maybe these kids tend to be pretty athletic, might have a little bit more trouble sitting still to do classwork or homework, whereas sometimes these low activity children thrive with things like that because they do enjoy a little bit less active activities like reading, being on the computer, those types of things. Engaging conversation with adults, whereas some of these are just a little too busy for that. Now, thinking about yourself and other adults, you might kind of think to yourself, oh, wow, I'm a pretty active temperament person. I'm always on the go. I love getting out and doing all kinds of athletic activities. I don't like to sit still. I'm always doing something. Whereas those low activity people are kind of like, yeah, I like to sit around and watch TV or go for dinner with friends and just talk and do those types of things. So kind of think to yourself where you are and look at some of the children that you know and work with and see where you think that they're fitting. Oh, distractibility. So this one is the ease with which we can be distracted, high, or ability to concentrate or focus and stay really into one task. So that would be low distractibility. So when we're looking at young babies, you might find that a highly distractible child will stop crying for food if they are rocked, or stop fussing if they have a pacifier, or given something during a diaper change to distract them. So, whatever is bothering them, they can quickly be sort of distracted or redirected from that. Whereas a low distractibility child would just really be persistent, for a good word, about continuing with what is bothering them. It will be really hard to find something to make it better. A 2-year-old would probably stop a temper tantrum if something else is suggested or another activity, something more interesting comes around. That they're a little bit easier to redirect, luckily, which can be handy. Whereas sometimes those low distractibility kids are really focused on what they want, and nothing else that you talk about, say, or do will get through to them at that point. They might just be like really zoned in on that, and nothing else will be acceptable at that time. 10-year-olds who are highly distractible need a lot of support getting their homework done. It probably needs to be really quiet, um, lots of support staying on task and coming back to what they need to be doing, maybe after taking a break. So it might be pretty hard and a little bit more choppy to get them to finish tasks. Whereas usually a 10-year-old who's low distractibility is pretty strong at doing and getting their work done. They can sometimes even have TV on or music when they're studying, doing things like that. As an adult who's highly distractible, you have trouble concentrating. You're really like noticing all these different things when you should be doing something else. Whereas often adults who are low distractibility have become really good multitaskers. Um, so next slide is intensity. So the intensity level of your emotional response. So that can be both positive and negative. It's really looking at um, when something happens, how are you going to express that? Are you going to be, oh, like something happened, but it's no big deal? Or, oh my gosh, this happened and it's a huge deal. And what causes those reactions for people on opposite ends will look totally different, which is kind of funny when you see it happen sometimes. So again, for a 2-month-old who is a high intensity reactor, you'll often get those cries pretty loudly, almost like there's an urgency happening here when they're wet. They might reject food vigorously when they don't want it. They might also really get quite vocal and upset, maybe even when they're tired. Anything is wrong and anything feels not good for them, you're going to be hearing about it. Whereas sometimes these low intensity reaction children don't seem as bothered, or they don't communicate that they're bothered by things like wet diaper, frustration. They almost seem to have that like a little bit more muted affect. Um, for 2-year-olds, you're going to see big feelings, both positive and negative, for almost everything that happens to them if they're an intense reactor. Whereas sometimes with the low intensity children, they really don't react to things in the same way. You might not even know that they've been injured or that something happened because they don't express it. They don't let you know. They don't seem to have a very big reaction. And that can be sometimes helpful because it seems like they're calm and more regulated. They do a little bit better under pressure. It can seem sometimes like they're uncaring or uninvolved, but really it's just because they're not as reactive. And sometimes it feels the opposite in comparison, right? Especially if you have those high reactors, because they are so involved and often vocal and letting you know everything along the way. Um, but they definitely, sometimes it can be hard to react to those strong reactions, right? So again, at 10 years old, you might see that their reactions to things seem almost disproportionate, or it's like they're overreacting, or they seem a little bit extra. And it can be hard to sort of talk them through and help them regulate. Whereas a 10-year-old who has low intensity will just sort of say, oh, I made a mistake, fix it, no big deal, not react when you're sort of doing disciplinary measures or those kinds of things. Or when there's, anything that goes on between peers, you might not see a big reaction. Whereas any age between these two, you're going to see, so and so did this, or you might just hear a scream or a pushback or things like that. So these high intensity kids can give us a run for our money, that's for sure. In adults, thinking about yourselves again, do you feel like you get fired up pretty fast? Does your blood boil pretty quickly? Are you passionate? Are you reactive to things? Or are you a little bit more reserved and quiet and keep things to yourself? When we're looking at regularity, this sort of means the predictability of biological functions generally. So sleeping, eating, toileting. The nice thing about those that are high, there's some strengths there, is that they're predictable and consistent. And again, sometimes that just means, oh, I know when to put them for their nap, and I know that they're going to sleep, and I know that they're going to eat at this time, and it does help with potty training. Um, so when we look at 2 months old, we know that they're going to feed every regular interval of hours, whether that's every 2 hours, every four. We kind of know when they're going to have their dirty diapers. So it almost becomes sort of like clockwork. Like you just get into that routine really easily. Whereas with an irregular child, you might find that, hey, they're feeding at very unpredictable times. They might need to feed every hour for a little bit, and then they might not feed for like 5 hours, and they're going to wake at really different times. So it can be difficult to get them on a track and a schedule that works for everyone. Sometimes with 2-year-olds, if they're highly regular, you know they're going to have a good lunch. They're always going to have snack at certain times. You might also be able to get really good at predicting when they're going to need to use the bathroom, which again, around 2 to 3 gets really helpful if you're working on potty training at the center. And that might help explain why some are easier than others to potty train. Nap time might change a lot. Toilet training is more challenging if they're low regularity. At 10 years old, a highly regular child would pretty much only eat at mealtime, sleep the same amount every night, go to bed at the same time, whereas a low regular child would be variable in terms of how much they eat, when, what they eat. I mean, let's talk about picky eaters here. They're just not regular. They don't like the same things every day. They get sick of things quickly, I find. So just thinking about all those things when you're trying to cover the basics for the children in your care, you really might notice that some are a lot more regular than others. And again, thinking about ourselves, it's really important as we go through all of these traits to think about them for yourself and for the children that you're working with. So, am I one who eats at regular times or not? Do I sleep consistently or is my sleep all over the map? So, really thinking about that and how that helps you understand others. Sensitivity. So, this is how you respond to physical stimulus and the sensory considerations like light, sounds, textures, smells, all those kinds of touch, all those kinds of things. So, um, knowing that high sensitive people, they notice small things and they actually do feel things differently. We looked at reactivity level in one of our previous slides, and often someone who's very sensitive might be more likely to communicate that, but not necessarily. Some kids might still really feel something that we don't notice in a strong way, but if they're low reactivity, they might not express it or tell you about it, whereas a high reactivity would. So they're not the same thing, but they kind of they seem similar. And I just don't want to get confused that they mean the same, because really you could be really highly sensitive but low reactivity. So a lot of times our sensitive kids will maybe have a little bit more tendency to let us know because they feel things strongly, but that's definitely not always the case. And we have to be sensitive too to those kids who are sensitive and maybe not letting us know, and us picking up that there might be a problem. So when they're really young, around 2 months old, they might be hear a really small noise that other babies might not even seem to notice, and they might stop eating, and their whole sensory system might be like sort of on alert, on alarm, what's going on, and really in tune to things that others don't notice. It does mean that they're often overwhelmed in a busy environment, or even if you feel like you've created a pretty calm environment, they still might be a little bit more likely to get overwhelmed. Whereas those low sensitivity kids just don't kind of rate those experiences. They don't even seem to notice things. They're really adaptable. They don't seem to mind the difference between things like bottle and breast. So just all those sensory experiences don't seem to impact them the same way. Their system is a little bit more like calm and not getting alerted by every experience. Um, at 2 years old, you might sort of see things like they're trying to avoid sounds. They're really rejecting certain foods. They might find certain clothing uncomfortable, tags, snow pants, things like that. You might find it seems really hard sometimes to get through the day with some of these very sensitive children because their bodies are going into like a little bit overdrive with all of these experiences throughout the day. Whereas a low sensitivity child seems pretty happy in most environments. They'll try new things, they'll touch things, they'll feel pretty comfortable. At 10 years old, you might see, okay, things like water temperature have to be perfect. They avoid things that are too bright, noisy, hot, or cold. And at those low sensitivity kids don't even seem to notice some of those sensations within their own bodies, like feeling illness, headaches, those kinds of things. And they tolerate lots of different environments and scenarios. Adults you might see later become picky eaters. They might have trouble sleeping because they hear everything or a bed feels different, those kinds of things. They might get distracted easily at work by, sounds, smells. A lot of places have scent-free environments now, and that's often because some people are much more highly sensitive to them than other people, and they can even cause migraines and things like that for them. So always good to be thinking about people who are sensitive in our environments and what can we do to sort of accommodate for that and make the world a little bit more of a comfortable place. Whereas our low sensitivity people can sleep anywhere, try new things, do whatever, and it doesn't seem to bother their system as much as others. So approachability, this is the response to new places, situations, or things. So at 2 months old, they might look around and seem really interested, whereas a low approachable child would be like, I don't think so. Put on the brakes with a new environment and maybe fuss or cry a little bit more. So I'm just noticing too, we wrote high means yes, I'm into it, and low means no, I don't think so. Pump those brakes. So a 2-year-old might really go up to other kids and introduce themselves. They settle in quickly to a new childcare environment. If educators change in the room, they might be like, "That's fine. Who are you? I'm so and so." Whereas this would be really difficult for a low approachability child. They might have trouble coming into a group. They like things that are familiar. They wouldn't like change. Like if an educator is sick, they might be really off that day. Or if you're trying out a new activity, they might really resist it at first. At 10 years old, that sort of just continues, like going to new places and things, exploring, whereas those low approachability kids get homesick. They prefer to watch from a distance first. They might not leaving the house. They might not like going to camps and stuff like that, even though they might warm up a little bit over time, like we talked about before. Adult, again, eagerly approaches new situations or people. They might love traveling, whereas people with low approachability might say, not too sure about this. There's lots of different components about that that make them feel a little bit more hesitant or uncomfortable. And it might take a little bit more time to make some new friends and get used to people and feel comfortable. So adaptability is sort of similar. To approachability, but not the same. So it's really more how they adjust to changes and transitions. So does that go okay for them, or do they feel really uncomfortable and resist those kinds of things? So they do sort of overlap and are similar in some ways, but one is sort of more about the schedule and one is how you approach a new situation. So at 2 months old, you might notice that a highly adaptable child enjoys a bath and is okay with having diapering, those kinds of things. Whereas at low adaptability, they might resist some of those like changes and parts of the routine that take them away from what they were doing and doing something else. So a 2-year-old might really easily and quickly say, "Oh, well, we're going to go to grandma's now. Okay, I'm good with that." Whereas a 2-year-old who has low adaptability might really have trouble ending the play that they're doing, getting ready to leave, go in the car and go to that new environment. So there's lots of things they have to adapt to in order to be able to get through those transitions and changes in a routine. Um, my kid is pretty, I was just thinking about an example when I um, got him from daycare the other day. My husband usually does the pickup, and that's sort of the routine. That's what he's used to. But every once in a while, maybe I'm done early or my husband has something he needs to do. So I go and get him. And I always think, oh, he's going to be so happy because he sort of likes being with mom, right? So I'm like, this is going to be great. And I went to pick him up and he just looked at me like, why are you the one that's here? That's not what's supposed to be happening. So that kind of shows that he's a little bit more lower adaptability. He was like, you changed the routine here. You changed what I expected. And his reaction to that, like he wasn't totally upset, but he was definitely thrown off, and I didn't get the warm welcome that I was hoping for. So, just a good example of seeing that around a 2-year-old. And you might notice that sometimes with some of your kiddos in your programs. So, at 10 years old, they might adjust really well to new changes, people in the program. Um, However, again, like I mentioned, low adaptability would really not do well with a supply teacher or, switching rooms in the childcare program, that kind of thing. And it just carries on into adulthood. So, hey, changing up the routine or activities is no problem for those high adaptability. Whereas, maybe even changing dinner time would be a pretty big deal for someone who's low adaptability. Persistence is the length of time that someone continues in an activity in the face of obstacles. So, um, a highly persistent child would keep crying until a need is met. It really does help them accomplish things if they're highly persistent, but sometimes it can also cause a struggle when they can't like give up or get stuck and move on. A low persistent person doesn't waste time if they're not able to do something, which is a strength, but it also causes a lot of opportunity for encouragement, supporting through frustration, not wanting to miss out on opportunities just because they don't want to keep doing something that's difficult. So often these kids need a lot of support, encouraging that persistence. Um, in 2 years old, a child might work on a puzzle until it's completed, whereas a low persistent child might give up easily if a toy is difficult or often be asking for help to do it rather than keep trying casually doing it on their own until they learn it. So a 10-year-old who's highly persistent might read for hours, does homework carefully, quickly, just works until it's done, whereas a low persistent person has trouble finishing books or homework. They might get up a lot during different tasks. They might abandon something that they thought they wanted to do if something different or better or easier comes up. And again, you might find this in adulthood. So they might continue despite all the obstacles. They don't get as frustrated. And some of these other ones move on really quickly. You see that frustration come very quickly, and it causes them to sort of step away from what they were doing and move on. So, mood looks sort of at how the child or person is viewing the world. So, do they see things in a bit of a positive, rose colored glasses kind of way, or are they a little bit more pessimistic and view things in a negative way? So if they have a high mood, which is a little bit more positive, you'll notice that these kind of people are a little bit more engaging. People respond better to them. They seem less stressed. They're a little bit more grateful. Sometimes these people might come off seeming a little bit superficial or a little too bubbly or like they trust people too easily. What's up with that? So some people are suspicious of that. Whereas low mood people are not easily fooled. They might be perceived as a downer, that they have high stress levels, those kinds of things. So in little babies, you might find, wow, this child is often making positive sounds, smiling, cooing, and a more negative mood child or low mood would be more fussy, crying frequently, that kind of thing. By 2 years old, you get lots of those laughs, giggles, enjoying everything around them. Whereas a low mood, a more negative mood child might be kind of frowning a lot or looking really serious or intense and those kinds of things. Later on in life, they're a little bit more positive, cheerful seeming, and noticing good things, saying good things about their friends. Whereas a 10-year-old who is low mood might more be commenting on what's going wrong, issues that are coming up, seeing lots of problems, those kinds of things. So if you're looking at adults, you kind of, if you're a Winnie the Pooh, you see the world, the glass half full of honey, or you might be an Eeyore and you see the glass half empty and you're sort of always moping and those kinds of things. So after having taken into account those 9 main traits, you also want to be thinking about the compatibility of a person's temperament with their surroundings is sort of referred to that goodness of fit. So, a lot of the traits that we talked about can make it difficult for children to feel comfortable in group care just because of their goodness of fit doesn't match as well. So, if they're around 10 other kids as a young toddler and they're a little bit more slow to warm up, that might be really, really difficult for them every day. And the sensory consideration. So sensitive kids might have a really, really tough time in group care because all those sensory experiences are a big deal to them and it causes them more stress throughout the day. Temperament traits interact with the environment and the people in that environment. So it's also really good to think about what are my temperament traits and how does that line up with the child and how does that impact what I'm understanding and expecting? Because if I'm high activity, I might just think like, why isn't everyone else wanting to do this, right? So we really have to think about that and how it impacts with a low activity child. So once we recognize a child's temperament, we can tailor our strategies and environment to engage, discipline, and teach them a little bit better. So children who enjoy high activity, low sensitivity, high approachability, and adaptability generally do well in childcare, unlike some of those ones that I mentioned before. And thinking about the match between people is really important. And some children are more sensitive or not sensible to discipline, and some respond better to positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement. So it's really good to get to know your little ones and what things are the most helpful for them. So now what does this mean? Really, really reflect on this for yourself and where you sit on all of these different traits and try and work together in your center to get to know where each child is. There's a really neat tool here, and the link is in the presentation, which you probably can't click on, unfortunately, but I did add it to the discussion question list. I found this a really, really helpful tool for myself. I think it really only has toddler and preschooler or infant and preschooler, something like that. But I think if you do, even if you have an older child, you can probably still fill out the preschool version and it will give some similar helpful advice. So it sort of matches you up with the child's temperament. And it says, if you're high activity and they're low activity, try doing things like this together to sort of support the child. So it's a really, really neat tool and it can help you get to know each of the children and how you can support each of them a little bit better, which is really neat. Other ways to know the child can be to ask parents or other educators who have had the child in their care before. The quiz is really, really helpful. I can't stress that enough. It helps you know how they fit and don't fit together. It helps you know and expect things like high reactivity and know where it's coming from a little bit better. And then when you look at the environment, try to look and see what is flexible in our program that we can change. You know, is there a way to make things a little bit either flow more smoothly in the program, or a way to have less transitions for some of those kids who really have a hard time with them? Where can you be flexible? Highly active children need more gross motor play. Is it possible to go out earlier and bring them in later from outside? So really just looking at what you can do. Can we split the group up a little bit? Are there ways that we can meet different children's needs better? If you have a child who's low in adaptability and slow to warm up to new situations, prepare them more in advance for things. Really let them know when transitions are coming up. Give them that extra time and support and comfort that you may need. Match your strategy to the child's needs, and continue to support flexibility and tolerance for these little ones. So that means trying not to allow the child's temperament traits to dictate too much of what's going on, making sure that they are able to work with their temperament trait in an environment that isn't sort of catering to them. So you're kind of looking at finding that balance of both. How can we make it more in line for the temperament traits that we have, but also when and how can we sort of push a child through that tolerance to be able to become more comfortable with things that maybe aren't suited to their personality traits or temperament traits. So it is really a difficult balance. And again, I suggest that you do lean into RC support for some of the children that you might be finding. How do we do that better? Or what should we change? What should we not? What should we push a little bit more with the child? What should we not? And again, feel free to go through the discussion questions about this presentation, and do make a referral to PACP services if you want to talk it through a little bit more and maybe brainstorm a little bit more. So our last slide is just a good reminder that every child is a different kind of flower, and all together make this world a beautiful garden. And really thinking about temperament as they're all going to have different needs. Some are going to need more water. Some are going to need a little bit more light. Some are going to be fine no matter where you put them. So really kind of keeping that in mind as you're dealing with the littles. And I hope this has been helpful and good food for thought, and definitely reach out to your RC or PACP if you want to make this a little bit more specific to your center in terms of what you can be doing. Thank you so much for listening. Take care.